All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Kenny. I'm JINS's Vice President for Government Affairs. I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar today on sustaining solutions on competing demands in the defense industrial base. As 2024 begins, significant conflicts continue to rage in Ukraine and Gaza. The U.S. defense industrial base faces increasing challenges to manage sustained aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan while also meeting urgent U.S. military requirements. Today's webinar will focus on what we can and should be doing urgently to ensure the readiness and capabilities of U.S. forces and those of our allies and partners, and what we can do to mobilize systemic solutions. Today's panel will be moderated by Ambassador Eric Edelman, who will introduce our distinguished panelists. Ambassador Edelman is a counselor at JINS's Gumundo Center for Defense and Strategy and co-chair of JINS's Iran Policy Project. He has extensive experience in senior positions in both the Departments of State and Defense as well as the White House, and most notably as former ambassador to Turkey. Sir, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's great to be here, and I'm particularly thrilled to be joined by a terrific good friend and colleague, Representative Michael Gallagher of Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. Representative Gallagher is, I think it's fair to say, one of the most distinguished members of the Congress when it comes to national security affairs. He was a Marine officer who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He has, since he joined, he's got a PhD in international affairs as well, which probably puts him in the top 1% of members of Congress in that regard. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and has been particularly focused on cyber matters. He was the co-chair of the Cyber Solarium Commission 2019 to 2021, and he currently is the co-chair of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China, along with Congressman Raja Krishnamurti. So welcome to you, Representative Gallagher. I'm very sorry about the Packers' loss to the 49ers, but I hope you take solace in the fact that they are the youngest team in the NFL on average, and Jordan Love was looking fabulous in both of those games.
Well, hope springs eternal in Titletown, USA. But I went in with no expectations to the playoffs, and then by the third quarter, I thought we were going to the Super Bowl. So I remain very depressed today.
Well, unfortunately, the topic we have today is also a bit depressing. Let me start by saying that I, as you know, co-chaired the National Defense Strategy Commission in 2018 that drew attention to the fact that America in 2015, during its counter-ISIL campaign, almost got to the bottom of its magazine of precision-guided munitions, and that we needed to put some attention onto the issue of munitions. And unfortunately, to show just how influential our commission was, nobody paid any attention at all to that recommendation. But I would say that today, Vladimir Putin and to some degree Hamas and maybe even the Houthis have done us a favor in the sense that they have put a spotlight on the fact that we have serious shortfalls when it comes to our stockpile of munitions in the Department of Defense and in the defense industrial base that produces those munitions. And I want to start, Mike, with a question of, explaining to our audience kind of how we got to this point. But I just want to throw out a couple of kind of factoids that I think are important to kind of bear in mind as we do that. So first, if you look at the volumes of fire in Ukraine, they have reminded us, I think, that modern warfare with near-peer competitors and even less than near-peer competitors, as Israel's finding out, takes up enormous amounts of munitions. So the Ukrainians have been subject to attack by 3,800 UAVs and 7,400 missiles, and that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the better-known issue with artillery rounds, 155 artillery rounds. The United States today, if we got into a fight in the Indo-Pacific, which is, I know, something you've been very focused on, we produced over a 10-year period 3,200 joint air-to-surface strike missiles, JASSM, which is one of the munitions, we would have to rely on quite a bit because of the range limitations on our, for instance, on our F-35 aircraft. The United States, on average, between 2000 and 2021, produced about 209 land attack cruise missiles, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. Yet we used to use 27 a day in Operation Iraqi Freedom when you were back in the day when you were serving, which means we could exhaust our full year supply in a week of intense combat operations. And we also have now the draw of the Hamas fight that Israel is in, which competes now a little bit for artillery rounds, certainly for missile defense interceptors. And we've got a $19 billion backlog of military equipment that we are meant to be supplying Taiwan to deter the PRC from a cross-channel invasion and disrupting global trade. So explain, if you can, how we got here.
Well, maybe to start strategically, and not to go too far back to history, but I do think it's important to sort of think about what happened after the end of the Cold War, which, to paraphrase what the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, said, in the 90s, we just had nobody breathing down the back of our neck. And so we deprioritized hard power. We made a series of wrong-headed assumptions about China in particular. And I would say we made a series of wrong-headed assumptions more recently about Russia. There's sort of a type of mirror imaging that tends to take place when we analyze these authoritarian regimes. I mean, if you look at some of the messaging coming out of the Biden administration prior to Putin's second invasion of Ukraine, you see this, right? I remember John Kerry said something to the effect of, something like this is unthinkable in the 21st century. We tend to think that people like Putin and Xi are sitting there sort of rationally calculating the utility, economic or otherwise, of certain geopolitical moves, and put aside the question of whether any of us are rational actors. In systems like that, without robust feedback loops, they could do things that look irrational from our perspective, but make sense from the perspective of preservation of the regime and staying in power. So I just bring that up to say, beyond sort of the budgetary dysfunction, I think there's a set of strategic assumptions that have led us to deprioritize hard power. But to get into the budgetary reasons for the sclerotic nature of our defense industrial base, Congress bears a big share of the blame, particularly with the Budget Control Act and the 112th Congress. Right now, you're seeing budgetary chaos play out with a series of continuing resolutions, which makes it very difficult for the Defense Department to plan. Appropriators traditionally hate multi-year appropriations, which are essential if you want to send a consistent signal to the defense industrial base to maximize the production of critical munitions and allow for companies to invest in facilitization. And I think because, things like 155s, and maybe I'll end here, or long-range anti-ship missiles, or SM-6, or JASSM-ER aren't quite as, let's say, sexy as other platforms that get more attention. We moved to minimum sustaining rates of production as opposed to maximum production rates, and therefore, we have very brittle stockpiles right now. It's a huge problem. I think we are missing a massive opportunity right now to completely rebuild and revitalize our arsenal of deterrence. And I actually think, obviously we're having this debate about Ukraine funding, the border. I actually think the president missed an opportunity. And again, Congress bears a big share of the blame too. After October 7th happened and he gave his Oval Office address, to make the case for support to Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine in a way that would have, I think, been more palatable politically right now. Put differently, if you can kind of talk to the American people about the fact that we need to rebuild our stockpiles of critical munitions, as opposed to making it more about the argument more about the fight for democracy in Ukraine, I think there was a more effective way to do this. I still think we have that opportunity right now. I haven't given up hope completely, but you're right to suggest that in every war game I've played, with respect to a conflict over Taiwan, we go Winchester right away. And the only short war over Taiwan would be a quick Chinese victory. And so this is something that demands our attention. It's why I introduced something called the Fires Act, which would allow the Department of Defense to take just the unspent money that it has at the end of every year, which has totaled about $10 billion for the last 5 years, and reapportion that to multi-year appropriations for critical munitions so that we can move to maximum production rates before it's too late.
Yeah, I mean that's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, which is kind of how we kind of fix this problem. But we took a procurement holiday in the 90s, as you said, after the Cold War, and as a result, we let the defense industrial base shrink, both the prime contractors, but also the subsidiary contractors who prepare parts, and industry moved to just-in-time, production. And what didn't catch up, as you were just suggesting, because I agree with you. Every war game I've ever been in, the problem is always that you start hitting the bottom of your magazine of munitions very quickly. The problem here is that we, over years and years and years of BCA and other things, have balanced the books of the Department of Defense by taking money out of the munitions accounts. That's on right. The assumption that we'll get whole next year. I remember having this discussion with the late Ash Carter, former Secretary of Defense, and we never get whole. We never actually replenish the stockpiles. And there are physics problems here. So, as you were saying, some of the assumptions that we make in our war planning are things like short war. Every war is going to be 30 days, 45 days, 90 days, and that's all we need. When in fact, what we're seeing is these wars are long and drawn out. And the other assumption we make is that we need to prioritize platforms and that we can surge production of munitions. And what we're discovering is the consolidation, the just-in-time, all these factors together, lack of investment, have created physics problems because you can't ramp up that quickly. I mean, Raytheon, I think, makes 300, Patriot interceptors a year. And just look at what, Ukraine is going through. Israel needs these kinds of interceptors. So the Fires Act, that's a great initiative. I hope it meets with success. But what are some other steps you think that we can take? I mean, to try and deal with this. You talked about multi-year authority. There has been some multi-year authority granted to the Department of Defense, but the appropriators haven't actually appropriated any money to make good on that.
This is a persistent problem that my good friend and mentor, the former Congressman Mac Thornberry, former chair of the Armed Services Committee, talked about a lot, which is that if you actually examine sort of the last 20 years, we've given the Department of Defense a lot of authorities to do creative things. There's all sorts of different authorizations for funds and this and that. But DoD doesn't really use these creative authorities, and then the appropriators don't appropriate money towards those funds, which is a huge problem. I was joking the other day about having like a quarterly authority Thunderdome with DoD, just to put some pressure on them for, hey, we passed this, why aren't you using it? But we'll see if I can get that going. A quick note on the Fires Act. It was interesting, and I should note that this is an idea that I stole from Bob Greenwald. But as a member of Congress, all I do is steal other people's ideas and take credit for them. That's the business I'm in. When we proposed it to DoD or asked for some technical assistance and feedback on the bill, the DoD comptroller basically said, we don't want this. We don't need it. which really shocked me because here I was trying to give them more money for something we all agree in the wake of Ukraine, in the wake of October 7th, in light of the eroding balance of conventional power in the first island chain in the Indo-Pacific and across the Taiwan Strait in particular. This is something we all agree we need, and yet the response from DoD was, nah, no, thank you. Thanks for your interest in national security. And I don't know if that's just bureaucratic inertia or general skepticism of Congress, but that really that was really disappointing. And I think it's time that we need to explore creative options like this. And this sort of gets to your question: what else can we do? When it comes to the backlog that you mentioned of foreign military sales, the $19 billion backlog for Taiwan, I actually think that well, first of all, part of the reason our foreign military sales process is suboptimal actually relates to congressional jurisdiction. Even though we're talking about military sales, the primary jurisdiction for FMS is in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because the State Department signs off on these. That creates a natural sort of jurisdictional confusion where the Armed Services Committee is trying to do one thing, the Foreign Affairs Committee is trying to do another thing. Both are pointing at each other, and therefore we're having problems clearing the backlog. But I believe this is actually something, if the president were so inclined to apply pressure, if the relevant congressional committees were to make it a priority, it's something we can make meaningful progress on. And right now, the situation is unacceptable. We have harpoons that were purchased in 2015 that aren't set to arrive in Taiwan until 2027, which is crazy to me. The other thing I think we should explore when it comes to harpoons for Taiwan is taking the hundreds of harpoons that we are putting into deep storage. We're going to demill. Granted, these are a different variant of a harpoon, and you need sort of policy permission to provide these to the Taiwans. But MacGyvering them and then giving them to Taiwan as opposed to putting them in a warehouse somewhere. And then finally, just to foot stomp the point on multi-year appropriation. When I went to Lockheed last, their claim was they could get to, with the predictability that multi-year appropriation provides, they could get to the production of about 240 long-range anti-ship missiles a year, which would be huge if we could do that. Think about the doing that over the course of the 5-year defense plan. What a massive win that would be. Now, I don't know if that's true, but we should test that hypothesis, and we should remove every excuse that Lockheed has in order to force them to get to 240 LRASMs a year. And the biggest thing they said they need is multi-year appropriation. And we're talking about a relatively small amount of money. The final thing I'd say that I think we should explore, Ambassador, is there's been some great work done in recent years about the fragility of our energetics industrial base. These are the propellants, explosives, and pyrotechnics that we put into our weapon systems, the things that make them go and go boom. We're still using an outdated generation of energetics. It's basically largely based on what's called HMX, as opposed to CL20, which is a technology we invented. It's called CL because it was invented in China Lake 20, that the Chinese actually use right now, and it gives their long range, their precision fires greater range and greater destructive power. If we were able to take the risk involved in using more advanced energetics and put them into existing weapon systems, we could, in my opinion, massively increase conventional deterrence by increasing the range and lethality of existing systems. And then things get really exciting when you start to think about the geography of the Indo-Pacific and where you could put these things, particularly now that we're no longer bound by the strictures of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that the Trump administration got out of. You can start to do some really creative things in partnership with our allies in the region.
Including Australia, the Philippines,
Exactly.
and of course, Japan. I think it's probably worth explaining for our audience that part of what you were hearing from Lockheed is a artifact of what we discussed earlier, which is the shrinkage of the defense industrial base down to a couple of primes. And the fact that essentially right now, in order to expand production, they would need to build additional floor space, factory floor space, in order to manufacture additional units. And the long pole in the tent that industry says it has, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, is recruiting the highly trained workforce that we need. And that's a challenge on multiple fronts. I mean, one is that we're in a period of historically low unemployment, so attracting workers, but also it requires really highly skilled workers, because this is not just kind of rolling, Model Ts off a factory production line at River Rouge, during World War II. This is this is actually kind of artisanal component to this, and these are highly engineered systems, which I want to come back to. So as you point out, industry is looking for that demand signal that this is not going to be a one-time infusion of cash, that they're going to go out, build a lot of additional factory space, hire a lot of workers, take on all that overhead, and then have the Congress, say, well, just kidding. Next year, we're not going to appropriate that, that kind of money. So am I wrong to say that to really get after this problem, one of the things, a necessary, but I'm not going to say sufficient condition, because I want to come to some others, is that we have to throw money at it, and we have to actually probably increase the top line for defense to really get after this? Is that a wrong assumption? And
I don't think it's wrong. No, go ahead. Sorry.
And if it is a correct assumption, you and I know you are rightly troubled by the pattern of continuing to govern through a series of continuing resolutions rather than actual authorization and appropriations legislation as was intended by the budget process. So how do we deal with that, and how much do you think we need to add to the top line to really get after this?
Well, first of all, I agree completely. You do have to throw money at the problem. But my supposition is that the predictability is the most important thing. And when you're just talking about critical munitions, you're actually not talking about a massive amount of extra money on top of the top line. For example, maybe, I mean, you can push back if you think this is Pollyannish, but if you had just an extra $10 billion a year over the course of the 5-year defense plan, and the predictability that comes with that, I think you could see a massive increase for the top 10 critical munitions that we think are a priority. And by the way, I think my list, your list, and Bill LaPlante's list would look roughly identical in terms of what we were prioritizing, right? So I actually don't think it's that big of a increase, at least just for the critical munitions. Now, you might have to spend money on creative ways to employ them. One idea that I've always been attracted to is this idea of containerized fires, and sort of putting, to put it crudely, sort of Connex boxes that have long-range precision fires in them all over creative locations in the Indo-Pacific to create decision-making dilemmas for the PLA. So there may be an additional cost that comes with that, but I actually, relative to the overall defense budget and some other expensive platforms, I don't think it's a big amount of money. And just to go back to, at the risk of being, plugging my own efforts here, the idea behind the Fires Act was to provide that predictability. And we have a GAO report that came out recently that said in the last decade, over $125 billion in American defense dollars have canceled at the Department of Defense. That means if they don't get spent by the end of the fiscal year, they expire. They then sit in abeyance for 5 years, where they can be used to pay old or unexpected bills, and they fluctuate between obligated and unobligated status. And and then they get canceled. So rather than that money evaporating and going back to the Treasury where it could be used for non-defense purposes, my thought was to allow the Pentagon the flexibility that other non-defense executive agencies already have, which is to use that money for other purposes. Again, the appropriators tend to be skeptical of things like this, and the DoD comptroller was skeptical of this proposal, but that was the idea behind it. As for budgeting and continuing resolutions, at the risk of sort of taking a detour into congressional reform, I've come to believe that one of the primary reasons for budgetary dysfunction in Congress that adversely impacts the Department of Defense is the basic divide between the authorizing committees, like the one I'm on, the Armed Services Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. So the authorizing committees say, DOD are allowed to do X, Y, Z, and the appropriators give DOD the actual money to do X, Y, Z. This divide goes back to the days when John Quincy Adams was in Congress. In the early 1900s, the committees were combined again, and then they were separated. It makes no sense to me at all. I think the same skill set that you would want in a member of Congress to do robust oversight of the Department of Defense it is applicable to both the appropriations and authorizing committees, and all these committees should be combined into one. There should be a defense committee that does oversight and funding of the Department of Defense. There should be a healthcare committee that does oversight and funding of HHS. The committee work is at times completely disconnected from each other, and therefore we either govern through a series of continuing resolutions that really negatively impact DoD because you don't have the ability to do new starts. I remember when Secretary Spencer was the Secretary of the Navy, he came to our committee and he said, because of budgetary dysfunction and continuing resolutions, the Navy just put $4 billion into a trash can and lit it on fire. That's what we're doing right now. It's a complete own goal. And so I think there's actually a way in which streamlining the committee jurisdiction in Congress would allow for a more coherent budget process. So sorry to go down that rabbit hole, but though I'm wedded to defense issues, I at times, my mistress is congressional reform. I'm interested in those issues.
Yeah, well, if you want to talk about a combustible, proposal with your colleagues, I suspect that would
yeah, not a lot of support for it.
That would be one. I worked for a Secretary of Defense one time who, after getting off a phone call with the chairman of the House Armed Services Defense Appropriations Subcommittee so they could do some reprogramming, turned to me and said, when I die, I want to be reincarnated as an appropriator. And this was a Secretary of Defense who'd actually served in the Congress at a pretty high level.
Well, just quickly, as outlandish as this sounds to those who know Congress, and I'll deny having said this if Calvert is on one of these soon. There was a legislative reorganization committee in the 90s. David Dreyer and some others chaired it. This was the centerpiece of their efforts. It didn't pass because of opposition from the appropriators, but the last time we did a major look at congressional reform, this is the proposal that they came up with. And the last time we had successful congressional reform, which was in I think the 40s, the centerpiece of the effort was a consolidation of committee authority. So the time has come for us to consider this. But yes, you're right. Some of my colleagues are not eager to tackle that. There was a proposal that we voted on about 5 years ago. It failed, but someone brought up a proposal to streamline the committee.
Yeah, that would be great, and it would be cleaner, I think. Let me ask you about investments. We've been talking about the role of the private sector. Is there a role for government investment in some of this? So for instance, one of the problems with artillery rounds is, shortage of, gunpowder and gun cotton, cellulose for gun cotton and things like that. Some of it is made at like one armory that was built in the 19th century in Pennsylvania that's still producing, black powder. is there a role, do you think, for some government investment in to make sure some of these, capabilities are there and to maintain excess capacity so we can surge? Part of the problem with, industry, of course, is they don't want to bear the burden of, the overhead that comes with, we may need it someday, but not now.
I think there is. Now, I'm not suggesting that the government should run, the Lockheed facility in Troy, Alabama. I don't think that would be a good idea. But what would be a good example? Well, when it comes to energetics, which I mentioned before, most of these are GOCO facilities, right? Government operated what is it? What is good? It's government owned, contractor operated
Operated, yeah.
facilities, right? So I'm not holding that up as an example of success, but given that energetics are such a niche thing, there's an opportunity there to modernize the energetics industrial base in a way where the government would own the facility, allow the private sector to partner with it, and I think maintain the excess capacity that private actors on their own wouldn't have. I'm trying to think what would be another example. You might have a better sense than I do. But more than anything else, what the government can do, what the Department of Defense can do, is just buy weapons. It's procurement, right? And that is also the story. I mean, to get to the first question you asked, like how do we get into this place? We focused on R&D at the expense of procurement. I mean, you look at Mackenzie Eaglin's done some really good analysis on just sort of like the amount of dollars going towards R&D versus procurement. We just need the Defense Department needs to be in the business of procuring weapons, like buying things. And perhaps some of this is related to what I think is some really bad strategic thinking that's come out. For example, I've been really critical of the national defense strategy right now, this idea of integrated deterrence, the idea that you could sort of somehow substitute soft power or other instruments of national power for conventional hard power. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think the fact that the Biden administration was out there bragging that about the success of integrated deterrence in Ukraine, when in fact deterrence failed in Ukraine, shows you how problematic the concept is.
I want to come back to the acquisition process and particularly the design of particularly advanced and precision munitions in a second. But before we go there, I wanted to ask, the problem, it seems to me, is so big that even if we did all the things that you suggested, Fires Act, using untapped funds to move them towards production, just the physics problem here in terms of the DIB here, it's going to take a while to overcome a bunch of that, even with investment. So one question I have is part of the solution here also, you kind of adverted to this in some of your opening comments, Representative Gallagher, working together with allies, both transatlantic and trans-Pacific, to, we have some examples, for instance, of working with Japan on missile defense, the SM2. Should we be doing more of that? I mean, to encourage joint efforts by our prime contractors with European and Asian defense contractors to produce more collectively. So even if we can't solve our problem, we can, working with others, help solve the larger problem. So in Ukraine, for instance, we've supplied a lot of stuff, but 50% of it's come from our European allies. And without that, the Ukrainians would be in a lot worse shape than they are already. So what's the role, and do we have to change the way we think about, you were talking about the state and the defense parts of this with the jurisdictional questions in Congress, but do we need to change the ITAR, the International Trade and Arms Regulations, to streamline this process and make it easier to work with allies to produce stuff so that they have, more stuff as well?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start there. Having just been critical of the Biden administration, let me say something nice. I think the AUKUS agreement was a huge achievement. I think if it realizes its promise, it could be transformative. And so I'm very supportive of AUKUS. Now, that being said, already we're running into challenges on both Pillar One of AUKUS, which is the provision of nuclear submarine technology to the Aussies, because our submarine industrial base is struggling, and we can't build 2.5 Virginia class subs a year, in part because of the workforce issue that you mentioned before. But I do still think we have an opportunity to make it work. And then there's Pillar Two of AUKUS, which defines the advanced capability areas that are most critical for us in partnership with the Aussies and the Brits. There's 6 areas. I'm probably going to get them wrong if I try and remember. Undersea, quantum, AI, hypersonic, cyber, and
Right.
EW.
Right.
But there, I think we have an opportunity to just break down all the barriers when it comes to and integrate the Aussies and the Brits fully into our defense industrial base. I mean, we on paper put them into our national technological industrial base about 6 years ago, but it didn't. I mean, it was just, it was words on the paper of a National Defense Authorization Act. It didn't really mean anything because of what you allude to. We still have all these outdated barriers to cooperation, primarily in the form of ITAR, International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, whereby we can't share some of our technology and our weapons because of these regulations and because of the institutional resistance, primarily at the State Department. We've been trying all year to reform ITAR to effectively create an AUKUS exemption for ITAR, and we're making progress, but still we're getting so much pushback from some Democratic members of Congress and by the State Department, which makes absolutely no sense to me. I think this is an area where we need to be willing to assume a lot of intelligent risk and start thinking about particularly when it comes to AUKUS, which is really the beating heart of the free world, sort of the center of the Five Eyes Alliance as well, to start thinking about our defense industrial base as one defense industrial base and break down all the barriers to cooperation, and then seek creative partnerships. You mentioned our allies in Japan. What's happening in Japan is really remarkable. I was just with the Japanese ambassador last week, and the investments they're making in their own defense, in asymmetric defense, is one of the most important things I've seen when it comes to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific in the last 2 decades. We should not only celebrate that and welcome that, but look for creative ways to partner with the Japanese. I'm trying to think what's another. There's some technology Taiwan has that we could actually benefit from. We have some American defense companies like Anduril who already have creative partnerships with the Aussies
Australia.
when it comes
Yeah.
to undersea technology. So all that's good. I mean, I guess at the simplest level, and this is going to sound simplistic or stupid for someone as erudite as you, Ambassador Edelman, but I'm always reminded of what the vice president of Taiwan, who's now the president-elect, told me when I went there a few months ago, where he said, if this is a one-on-one game, if it's you guys versus China, or certainly Taiwan versus China, China can win. But if we play as a team, if we sort of start to think about the free world as a team, there's no way China can win. And that goes beyond sort of creative ways to collaborate when it comes to building weapons. It comes to how we plan for war. It comes to putting in place the basic command structure through which we would fight a war with China that plugs in key allies and partners like Taiwan prior to deterrence failing and then having to make it up. This is the point that General Petraeus makes constantly about you need to put that structure in place now before a war actually happens in order to give you the best chance of preventing
That's
it.
leverage. No, I agree with that totally. And I think it's not simple-minded. I think it's actually very sophisticated insight. Representative Gallagher. So I want to turn to questions, and if we're going to just have a few minutes for that, but please, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A function, and I will curate them and put them to Representative Gallagher. But just one final question for you before we move to that. We've seen in the last week or so, the U.S. conducting strikes on Houthis in Yemen, who are basically threatening the navigation of the Red Sea. I mean, obviously, freedom of navigation's been, as a Marine, been a historic objective of the United States going back to its founding. But we've been in the position of having the U.S. Navy firing, $1 million missiles to intercept $60,000 drones, which clearly puts us on the sort of wrong side of the cost imposition curve. Israel has found itself similarly in that kind of position because of the rocketing from Hamas and some from Hezbollah in the north. They've solved that very creatively, in part with Iron Dome and David Sling, which essentially uses very smart algorithms to reduce the number of defense interception shots you need to take, which helps you drive down the cost per shot, and then ameliorates some of the cost imposition that is placed on you by your adversaries. We still have a ways to go here on that. I'm encouraged by the fact that the Brits say they've got this system Dragonfire, which is a laser system that they say takes down drones and missiles. Let's see how that goes, because that's pennies a shot and a bottomless magazine. If that's the case, that would be great. But should we also be, not just in terms of acquisition, but in the design phase of munitions, looking to reduce the overall cost? I mean, right now, a lot of our precision munitions rely on being queued by very expensive ISR assets, and then having to be linked up across the board. Should we be trying to build in, to kind of low cost munitions that are intelligent, using AI, can be collaborative with other systems, have their own sensors, so they don't have to rely, they're the final part of the kill chain, but you can incorporate so much of it into a lot of cheap munitions as opposed to the very exquisite high-end munitions. So should we trying to get, a better low-high mix, but with more using technology, additive manufacturing, things like that, to develop a better munitions mix for the future?
Yeah, I think so. And here I want to say, I was critical about the rollout of Replicator. This is the Deputy Secretary of Defense initiative to field, what's the new acronym we're using? It's not A2AD. I don't know. It's another gobbledygook acronym.
JADC2?
Well, no, it's attritable autonomous systems.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a play on anti-access era denial. Whatever. But I actually think we have an opportunity. I told the DepSecDef this. I want to make Replicator work, and I think it's an opportunity to do exactly what you're saying, to get on the right side of the cost curve, leverage technology, use highly attritable systems, and do rapid experimentation. The real question is, what prevented uniform and civilian leaders from moving quickly to capitalize on such technologies, such that it required the deputy secretary to intervene? And you mentioned Ash Carter earlier. I think if we wanted to do something like this, take intelligent risk, better leverage technology to get on the right side of the cost curve. I'm always reminded of Ash Carter's analysis, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, of the MRAP program and what it took to actually field thousands and thousands of MRAPs in a short period of time. It really took the Secretary of Defense himself waking up every single day and prodding the five-sided building to deliver in order for it to happen. And
over the objections of his deputy and the entire
Exactly.
bureaucratic universe. I was there and watched it in real time under Secretary Gates. You're absolutely right.
So whether it's systems like this or whether it's conventional munitions, I guess the lesson I derive from that, as depressing as it is that in order to rebuild our arsenal of deterrence, we're going to need a Secretary of Defense empowered by the president who makes it a priority. And again, wakes up every single day and pushes the building to actually deliver and pushes Congress. I was joking the other day saying that in my fantasy world that doesn't exist, the next Secretary of Defense in his first week on the job is going to take the chair and ranking member of the Defense Appropriation Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and do like a week-long tour of the munitions industrial base, go to Troy, go to all these other facilities. And then at the end of that, like lock everybody in a room and say, okay, how do we fix this? It's going to take something like that to actually get this done. If it's not the priority of the secretary, with the support of the president, I just don't think it's going to happen.
Unfortunately, I couldn't agree more. This has been a terrific conversation. I'm really grateful to you, Representative Gallagher, for indulging us here. We do have a couple of questions, so let me just put them to you quickly. We have one question: in your view, is there subcontractor resistance to multi-year procurement? And is it perhaps got to do with reduction of profit margins for both the subs and the primes?
Maybe, although I haven't encountered like vociferous opposition from subcontractors. But I think the trade-off would be, I mean, the predictability and guaranteed profit over time, I think would outweigh any sort of short-term reduction in the margin. But I mean, it's a good point. But I mean, I certainly haven't encountered a ton of opposition from subcontractors.
We have another question that is actually a little bit far afield from the question of munitions, but you're on the Armed Services Committee, so all is fair in love and war. The question has to do with the recruiting crisis that we're facing, with record low numbers of Americans signing up to join the services. I think your service is the only one that's actually made its recruiting numbers, if I'm not mistaken, the Marine Corps. But overall, goal has been missed by about 41,000. What do you think are the reasons for the emergence of this crisis in the all-volunteer force? And how do you think it would play out if we actually got into a conflict with China? I mean, what would be the impact of recruiting shortfalls if we had a conflict, God forbid, in the Indo-Pacific? And do you have some ideas about how to solve the problem?
Well, there's a great Wall Street Journal op-ed that Kevin Walston and Owen West wrote about 3 months ago that kind of digs into the data, particularly around propensity to serve, and basically makes the case, if I'm remembering correctly, that it's largely white liberals who account for the decline in enlistments in the all volunteer force. I don't mean that as like a political criticism, but they sort of just like lay out the data, and overall propensity to serve is down among the next generation. So you have to ask yourself why that is. I think it's fair to say there has been a politicization of the military in recent years that has made recruitment harder. And I don't mean that just as a the Pentagon's woke and I, as a conservative, am upset about that. But though I have been very critical about certain DI initiatives in the Pentagon, this idea that diversity equals lethality is dumb and makes absolutely no sense. there's been a lot of there on both in both parties. There have been recently retired general officers that have spoken at political conventions, and all that I think sort of
On both sides.
yeah, exactly. In some cases, there's a perception with a little bit of reality that we've lowered standards, and sometimes when confronting a recruiting crisis, we tend to sort of lower standards, which I actually think is the wrong way to go. And again, to go back to what I said about SecDef involvement, I actually think this is another issue that is going to require engagement from senior leaders. And this is a point that Tom Monken has made, or no, not Tom. Whatever, I'll remember it in a bit. Everywhere like the Secretary of Defense goes and senior leaders in the Department of Defense goes, like they should actually be recruiting. They should be giving speeches to high schools as part of a broader call to service. I'm always reminded of, I had this big fight with West Point because I had an amendment in the National Defense Authorization Act that would basically force athletes at West Point and the service academies to actually fulfill their service requirement, like David Robinson did and Roger Staubach did, as opposed to just going pro. And my argument at the time was, okay, if you say that people going, the rare occasion that someone goes in the NFL from West Point football is a massive recruiting windfall, then actually use these guys for recruitment. Like hold them to actual military grooming standards, and then in the offseason, have them go around the country and like recruit, fit athletic young men to serve. So, I mean, the problem is overdetermined. There's a lot of factors contributing to it, but I always focus on the declining propensity to serve. I think the politicization has not been helpful, but I really think we're at a point where it's a danger to the future and existence of the all volunteer force, which is why every year we have about one outside commission we're able to create. And my argument this year is going to be that we should create a commission on the future of the all volunteer force to get at this really thorny recruitment crisis that we're in right now.
Yeah.
What did I miss? What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think one of the other things that shows up in the data is that younger folks in the age cohort for recruitment, concluded that if you were in the military, you were going to end up, brain damaged with PTSD.
That's right.
Despite the fact that over the last decade, we actually had, just a handful of casualties in the 9/11 wars that were continuing in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. So there's, I think, a misapprehension about what military service is today. I do think one other issue which probably need to figure out is the marijuana issue, just because we rule out a whole bunch of kids, despite the fact that now, I don't know, in 24 states or something, it's legal. And so that's something I think we have to sort out. I'm mindful of your comment that we shouldn't just lower standards. I agree with that, but we may have to adjust some standards to changing social realities, I think.
Well, I mean, I would say if you had smoked weed at some point in the past, I mean, as long as you can meet the physical standards and not smoke weed when you join the military, I mean, it's
right.
Yeah. I mean, there's a way around that. I'm more interested in like the lowering of physical standards. By the way, when I was ranker of the military personnel subcommittee, I took all the different service physical fitness tests just to get a sense of what the differences between them, which was fun. I got to run it. I ran the armies with the sergeant major of the Army, who kicked my butt, by the way. He's a stud, even though he's 20 years older than me. But even just something as simple as when we lower physical fitness standards, I actually think that has a negative impact on recruitment. I always saw part of what drew me to the Marine Corps was the high standards, and I wanted to test myself to see if I could make it. And I was terrified the first time I took a physical fitness test, right? Like the first time I had to get up on a pull-up bar, but then it became part of my life, and I loved it.
I think we're running out of time, but I want to thank our guest, Representative Michael Gallagher of Wisconsin 8, for a terrific conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did as well. best of luck to you in your efforts to reform the Congress and to make sure that the U.S. military is fully funded, because I know that is a matter close to your heart, and I'm grateful to your efforts.
Well, thank you. To the extent I've been successful at all, it's because I have learned from the master, Ambassador Eric Edelman, and we've had many a conversation on the sidelines of the Reagan National Defense Forum while smoking a cigar about Pentagon history and Wisconsin greats like Mel Laird and
Yes,
things like that. So,
the greatest Secretary of Defense in my book.
yeah, of course, the man from Marshfield, whose gavel I now have, and every time you see me chairing the Select Committee on China, I'm holding Mel Laird's gavel in my hand. So
followed by close second by Bob Gates.
indeed. So thank you very much.